Welcome to New American Mythos, where old stories are kindled like firelight and we gather round to remember the tales that shaped us. Tonight we come to one of the great emblem stories of the Christian West, St. George and the Dragon. Now, we tell this story not because we need another tale where a hero wins, but because we need stories that remind us of what courage is for. In the old tellings, this was a story of empire. The Roman world still held sway, its governors ruled from far-off palaces, its cities stood behind high walls, and its emperors demanded not only taxes, but worship. St. George is believed to have lived in that age, sometime around the 3rd or 4th century, when Christians still died for refusing to bow. The legend places him in a city called Selene, a name not found on maps, but remembered in story as a place of dread and compromise. It is a city of soul as much as it is of stone, a stand-in for any people who have learned to bargain with fear. But the tale did not stay Roman. As it traveled westward, it clothed itself in the symbols of later centuries: dragons and princesses, courts and castles, saints who rode alone across a haunted land. So, we listen with both ears, one to the age of empire, and one to the medieval hall where the story became memory. In the old imagination, George wasn't only a character on a page, he was a picture on the wall. This legend was made for public memory, told in community, recited where craftsmen gathered, with painted panels surrounding the hall like a ring of witnesses. A city under fear, a dragon in the marsh, a saint who refuses to bow. That matters for how we hear the story. It was never merely entertainment. It was, and still is, instruction, courage taught by image, by repetition, by shared remembrance. And it speaks straight into our themes this season: faith, courage, and the defense of kingdoms. Because every kingdom, even every household, every town, every people, must decide what it will sacrifice to feel safe. Sometimes the threat is obvious: teeth and fire in the wilderness. Sometimes the threat wears perfume and authority, a court that demands worship, a regime that insists you bend just a little to survive. This legend gives us both. First, a city bargains with terror until terror asks for something unbearable. Then, a tyrant bargains with conscience until conscience must either break or become free. So tonight, listen for more than a spear thrust. Listen for the deeper battle, the moment when a people realizes that fear has become an idol, and the moment when a saint proves that the soul can still refuse the throne of terror. This is St. George and the Dragon, and in the end, the true triumph will not be that a monster dies. It will be that a man will not kneel to the monster. St. George and the Dragon, the saint's triumph. In the days when kings still believed their crowns could keep terror out, and when cities believed stone walls could save a conscience, there stood a coastal town at the edge of a wide, thirsty country. It was called Selene in the Old Latin, and Lycene in some English mouths, names that sound like wind moving through reeds. The place was not rich, but it was proud. Its gates were sound, its market was busy, its king was decent by the standards of men who keep their own hands clean by never looking too closely at how sausage is made. And just beyond the walls, beyond the orchards and the last low cottages, the land sank toward marsh and brine. That low place was the city's shame. A dragon lived there. No bright fairy serpent from a child's book, but a thing like an ancient wound in the earth. It lay among reeds and black water, Its scales caught the sun in dull flashes, like old armor left too long in rain. Its breath carried a stench that turned stomachs, and the air around it grew sickly, as if creation itself had learned to flinch. At first, it did what beasts do. It fed. It took sheep from the pastures, and sometimes goats, and sometimes cattle that wandered too far. Then it took men. One careless traveler, one drunken hunter, one boy who ran too far after a stray dog. The city grieved. The city feared. The city swore oaths. And then the city began to bargain. It started small, the way compromises always start. 2 sheep each day, a measured offering, controlled, predictable, like a tax paid to keep a highwayman from burning your house. The elders called it prudence. The king called it mercy. The people called it survival. But the marsh did not grow satisfied. The dragon's hunger widened, and the city's fear widened with it. 2 sheep became 4. 4 became 6. The flocks thinned. The shepherd's hands cracked with the work of trying to coax life from land that was slowly being offered up to the mouth of terror. And one evening at the council table, where men spoke in sober voices and made decisions that never touched their own skin, someone said what no one wanted to say. "We cannot keep paying with sheep." Silence held the room. A torch hissed. Outside, a child laughed, one of those bright sounds that makes adults feel guilty because it reminds them of what they are all failing to protect. "What then?" another asked. There are moments when a people become something else. Not all at once, not with thunder, often with paperwork, often with a vote. They made a statute. They told themselves it was fair. No family would be singled out by malice. They would cast lots. Chance would decide. Fate would shoulder the blame. They began sending out human life, 2 each day, chosen by the turning of stones and sticks, as if randomness made cruelty righteous. They wept, yes, they held funerals, they told stories about sacrifice and necessity, but the practice continued. And after a while, the city grew used to the shape of grief, the way a man can grow used to a limp. And always, like a dark hymn underneath every decision, the truth repeated itself. Fear will always demand more. Let's pause here for a moment. Fear will always demand more. This is the first terrible wisdom of this legend. The dragon is dreadful, but what truly hollows the city is the bargain it makes with dread. Fear becomes an economy. It becomes a policy. It becomes, quote, reasonable. And before long, men are no longer asking what is right. They're asking what will keep the screaming away for one more night. That's how idolatry works in a civilized age. It rarely begins with open blasphemy. It begins with a small compromise that seems manageable, until the compromise trains the conscience to call evil necessary. And if we're honest, we recognize the pattern, not only in medieval towns, but in every society that tries to purchase peace by feeding something it should have fought. Once fear becomes your master, it will always raise the price. So, this is the question the story presses into us early. When fear asks for a little, do you refuse? Or do you start building a world where the innocent pay the bill for everyone else's comfort? Let's get back to the story. The lot fell on a butcher's son, then a potter's daughter, then the old widow who lived by the well, then a soldier's brother. And each time the city performed the ritual again. The chosen one dressed, the gate opened, the crowd gathered with faces tight and blank. The victim sent out beyond the walls, and the gate shut again, as if the stone could shut out the sound of screams. The king watched it happen from his high window. He did not like it. He told himself he hated it. He told himself he would end it when there was a better option. But a crown is a strange thing. It can feel heavy with responsibility while still making a man cowardly. It can convince him that his first duty is to keep the peace, not to keep the good. And so the statute stood, that is, until the morning when the lot fell on the king's own daughter. That is how idols reveal themselves. They demand the thing you never thought that you would have to give. The princess was not a child. She was old enough to understand what the city had become. She had watched the lots for months. She had seen the way mothers aged overnight. She had heard the prayers in the temple grow bitter, as if the gods owed the people repayment for their obedience. When the lot was announced, the queen made a sound like an animal caught in a snare. The king's face went gray. He demanded a new drawing. He demanded an exception. He demanded that his authority matter. But the elders, those same men who had built the statute, looked at him with the calm cruelty of law once it has become a machine. "If we spare her," one said, "then the statute is broken. And if it is broken, who will ever trust the lot again?" The king stared at them, and something broke behind his eyes. He saw suddenly the full horror. He had built a system to keep terror satisfied, and now the system was demanding his own blood. He begged, he threatened, he offered gold. But fear does not accept gold. It accepts only flesh. The princess stepped forward before the argument could turn into a riot. "Father," she said, and her voice was steady enough to shame the room, "do not make yourself smaller by bargaining now. If the city must repent, let it repent later. But do not teach it that law is only law when it protects kings." And the king looked at her as if she had become someone older than him. "And you?" he whispered. "What do you do?" She did not pretend she was unafraid. And yet she replied, "I go." They dressed her in gold and gemstones, as if finery could make a sacrifice noble. They pinned a veil over her. They placed a sheep at her side like a final insult, one last tribute, as if a beast could be appeased by ceremony. The crowd gathered at the gate. Some wept openly. Some stared at the ground. Some watched the sick fascination of people relieved it was not their household this time. The king stood with his hands clenched, trembling. The princess kissed her mother's forehead. She touched her father's arm. Then she turned and walked out. Beyond the gate, the road dipped toward the marsh. The air grew damp and cold. Reeds whispered. The earth underfoot felt softer, as if it might swallow her. She had gone only a little way when she stopped, because she realized something plain and terrible. The city had sent her out alone. Not one guard with her, not one soldier, not one friend. They had dressed her like a bride, but they would not even walk beside her. So she did what the human heart does when it finally runs out of its own scaffolding. She knelt, not to perform, not to impress. She knelt because standing had become too heavy. She prayed, fumbling, frightened, half angry, half begging, as she had been taught, reaching towards the gods her city named, because she had no other ladder to climb. And in that desperate reaching, however clouded, her heart still confessed the one thing fear tries to deny. I cannot save myself. If her prayer had reached some idol or some abstraction, it would have died in the reeds. But prayer is a strange thing. Even when the mind is confused, prayer is still a confession. I cannot save myself. She was still kneeling when she heard hooves. A rider approached from the inland road, a single figure in mail and travel-stained cloak, not bearing a city's banner, not escorted by soldiers. His horse was strong, but not showy. His face was calm in a way that made her afraid, because calm in a world like this often means ignorance. She rose quickly, wiping her eyes. "Sir," she called, "turn back! For pity's sake, turn back! If you linger here, you will perish with me." The rider drew near and reined in. He looked at her, gold-clad, pale, trembling, and he understood at once that she was not wandering. She was being offered. "What is this place?" he asked. "A city," she said, and bitterness entered her voice. "A city that pays for peace, with blood." He studied her face and saw what her finery couldn't hide. A courage strained thin by dread, like cloth stretched over bone. "And you?" he asked. "Why are you here?" She lifted her chin. "Because the lot fell on me." "The lot," he repeated quietly. "Yes," she said. "The city calls it fair. It calls it necessary. It is the law." The rider's gaze drifted toward the marsh, as if he could already smell the breath of the beast. "And you?" she asked suddenly. "Who are you that you ride alone into this?" He did not answer with a boast. "I am George," he said. The name meant nothing to her then, but the tone of it did. It was the tone of a man who did not expect to be saved by cleverness. "Go," she pleaded again. "You cannot fight this." George's eyes stayed on the marsh. "I do not know what I can do," he said, "but I know what you cannot do alone." He dismounted. He knelt, not before her, but beside her, like a man stepping into the same burden. And he spoke a sentence that seemed to cut through the reeds like a blade. "Faith demands the whole heart." She stared at him. He rose, placed his hand on his sword hilt, and waited. The dragon came. It did not rush like a dog. It emerged slowly, as if it knew time belonged to it. Reeds bent and snapped under its weight. Water sloshed. Its head lifted, and its eyes fixed on the princess, bright and ancient, the eyes of a creature that has never been ashamed of hunger. The princess's legs trembled. George swung up into his horse. "Stay behind me," he said. She tried to answer, but her throat locked. She could only nod, hands clenched around the edge of her veil. George lowered his spear. Then, before he charged, he made the sign of the cross. It was not a gesture for show. It was not a charm. It was an oath, visible in the air. I belong to Christ, not to fear. Then he drove the horse forward. The spear met scale. The impact jolted George's arm. The dragon recoiled, roaring, and the sound shook birds from trees. The princess watched with her hands at her mouth. She did not cheer. She did not faint. She did what strong people do when they cannot help with their arms. She prayed. Not to manipulate the world, not to enable a miracle as if grace were a lever, She prayed because the only thing left to her was to ask God for mercy. George wheeled the horse, kept his seat, and struck again. The dragon lunged, and for a heartbeat it seemed the beast would swallow him and the horse alike. But George's spear drove in deep, and the dragon jerked back, wounded. It thrashed, half in water, half on land, bleeding dark into the marsh. George pulled back, breathing hard. The princess stared at the beast, waiting for it to surge again. Instead, the dragon's movements slowed. Its pride seemed to waver. It looked uncertain. George dismounted. He walked toward the princess. She stared at him as if he were a vision. He spoke gently, almost strangely, as if he were telling her to do something ordinary. "Take your girdle," he said. "Make of it a band. Go to it. Put it around its neck." Her mouth opened. She looked from George to the dragon and back. "That is madness," she whispered. George's gaze stayed steady. "You were sent out to die," he said. "Do not let fear keep you dying in your heart. Come." She swallowed. Her fingers trembled as she unfastened the girdle from her dress. It was soft cloth, embroidered, scented faintly with the perfumes of a palace. It felt too delicate to touch the throat of terror. She took another step, then another. The dragon's head turned toward her. Its eye rolled, and she stopped. A tremor ran through her. Then, quietly, almost without intending to, she whispered, "Lord, help me." She stepped forward, reached out, and looped the girdle around the dragon's neck. Let's pause again here. This is where the legend becomes more than a rescue scene. The princess is not merely a prize, she becomes a witness, and her courage takes a form most of us actually recognize: trembling obedience. She does the next faithful thing, even while her body shakes, and in that small act, the whole city's spell begins to break. Because fear thrives on passivity. Fear loves to turn people into spectators, watchers of tragedy, consumers of dread, citizens who say, "What can we do?" until they believe it. But the princess steps forward. She doesn't become the hero in the modern sense. She becomes what so many faithful people become in the real world: a participant in deliverance, a hand that moves when the heart wants to freeze, a prayer offered when the mouth can hardly form the words. And this is one of the most Christian shapes in the whole story. Courage as dependence, not bravado, not self-worship, but a soul that moves toward the good because God is greater than fear. Let's return to the story. The dragon did not snap its mouth. It did not bite. It lowered its head, as if obedience had been placed upon it like a weight. The princess's breath hitched. She tightened the girdle in her hands. George watched her, and for the first time she understood what he meant. Courage isn't always the strike of a spear. Sometimes it is the trembling step taken toward what once ruled you. "Lead it," George said. She did, the end of the girdle in her hand, and the dragon followed. The princess, gold-clad, tear-streaked, walked toward the city gate with the nightmare trailing behind her like a shameful captive. George walked beside her, sword in hand, not triumphant, but watchful. And in the air, like a hymn repeated in a minor key, the truth sounded again: fear will always demand more. When the city sentries saw them, they shouted. When the crowd saw them, they screamed. Some fled, some climbed the walls, Some fell to their knees. The king rushed to the gate and froze because his daughter was not walking out to die anymore. She was walking back, holding fear on a leash. George lifted a hand. "Do not run," he called. "Do not shout. Look." The dragon stood in the road, wounded and bound. The city stared at it, and for the first time in months, it looked smaller than their dread. George turned to the people. Now his voice changed, not louder, but deeper, like a bell sounding in a stone hall. "You have fed this thing," he said. "You have paid it. You have built your life around it." The elders bristled. The king's face tightened. George continued. "You have called it necessary. You have called it law. You have labeled it peace." His gaze swept the crowd, and the crowd knew that he saw them. "But it was never peace," he said. "It was tribute. And tribute is worship wearing a mask." The city grew still. "Do you want deliverance?" George asked. 1,000 throats could not answer. George pointed not at the dragon, but at the people. "This beast is not your only enemy," he said. "Fear has become your master, and a master always demands more." There it was again, the refrain now spoken into the public conscience. Fear will always demand more. Some in the crowd wept. Some clenched their fists. Some simply stared at the ground. The king stepped forward, voice raw. "What would you have us do?" George looked at him. "Turn," he said. "Turn from your idols. Turn from your bargains. Turn to the living God." He spoke then of Christ, not as a private opinion, but as a king above kings. He spoke of mercy that does not require the sacrifice of children. He spoke of judgment that falls on wickedness, not on the weak. He spoke of a kingdom where fear does not sit on the throne. And the city, shaken, humbled, and desperate, consented. They pledged to be baptized. They vowed to forsake their old worship. And only then did George lift his sword. He walked to the dragon. The beast's eye rolled toward him. George spoke one last quiet prayer, and then the blade fell. The dragon's head dropped into dust. A cry rose, not of panic, but of release. Men fell to their knees. Women clutched children. The king wept without shame. They hauled the carcass out with wagons and ropes, dragging the dead terror beyond the walls, far from where they had given their tribute. And in the days that followed, the city built a church, and the people told the story as a kind of confession that the dragon had been real, and so had their cowardice, and that God had sent help not because they deserved it, but because mercy is God's habit. George did not stay to become a statue. He spoke to the king privately. "Honor the church," he told him. "Remember the poor. Order your days toward God." In other words, do not rebuild the old bargain in a new form. Do not make the dragon's grave into a foundation stone for another idol. Then George rode on, and the princess watched him go. She did not wave like a child. She stood with her hands clasped, still trembling, still praying, because she had learned what every delivered person learns. Deliverance is not only being rescued from a monster. It's being rescued from becoming the kind of person who would pay monsters to stay quiet. George rode eastward, and the land changed. Hills rose. Roads hardened into stone. He entered territories where power lived not in reeds and fear, but in councils and courts. And in those lands there was a man who ruled with the kind of power that does not negotiate. His name was Dacian, a governor, a lord of the emperor's will. He carried authority like a blade, and he treated faith as treason. When word reached Dacian of a city turned, of a champion preaching Christ openly, of people forsaking idols, Dacian's rage ignited. Because tyrants do not fear only swords, they fear allegiance. A man can obey laws and still be dangerous if his worship belongs elsewhere. So Dacian commanded George to be seized. George did not flee. He had faced a dragon in a marsh. He was willing to face a dragon in a hall. They brought him into the court. It was not like the marsh, no stench of rot, no reeds, no water. The air was clean, torches burned steady. Officials stood in neat lines, faces trained to look indifferent. This was a more civilized kind of terror. Dacian sat high, eyes cold. "You are George," he said. "I am," George replied. "You have spoken against the gods," Dacian said. "You have turned people away from sacrifice. You have dishonored the emperor's peace." George's answer was simple. "I will not worship what is false," he said. "I belong to Christ." The court murmured. Some scoffed. Some looked uneasy, because simple conviction has a way of unsettling the clever. Dacian leaned forward. "Then you will suffer," he said, as if suffering were a weapon that he owned. He ordered George stripped and beaten. He ordered torments meant to break not only the body, but the will. He meant to make an example of him, an argument in flesh. George endured. The story does not paint him as numb. Pain is pain, but it does paint him as steadfast. Because courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is obedience when fear is reasonable. That night in the prison's dark, George prayed. And the legend says that Christ appeared to him, not to erase the suffering, but to interpret it rightly, to promise that what the tyrant called defeat was, in truth, victory. Faith demands the whole heart. In the morning, Dacian tried a different road. He produced poison, bitter, deadly, mixed with the kinds of superstitions that always cling to power when power grows desperate. "Drink," he said. "Prove your God." George looked at the cup. He made the sign of the cross. He drank. The poison did not kill him. A man in the court, a maker of poison, a servant of the tyrant, stared as if the world had cracked open. Something in his conscience woke. Trembling and terrified, he fell to his knees. "I believe," he whispered. "Have mercy." Dacian's face hardened, because mercy is intolerable to tyrants. Mercy means the tyrant is not God. He ordered the man executed, and the story insists the man's blood became his baptism, not because blood is magic, but because God sometimes receives repentance even at the edge of death. Dacian watched and thought he had regained control. He had not. Fear will always demand more. And so Dacian demanded more suffering, more spectacle, more proof that he still ruled reality. He ordered a wheel set with blades. He strapped George upon it. The wheel broke. He ordered boiling metal. They plunged George into it. The story says that George emerged, preserved, not because saints are made of stone, but because God can make the tyrant's instruments fail. The court began to shift. Not openly, not yet, but you could feel the air change, the way you can feel a storm coming, a tightening, a pressure. Dacian sensed it too. So he moved to the heart of the matter. He brought George into a temple filled with idols, stone faces, gilded eyes, gods made by human hands and then treated as rulers. "Perform a sacrifice," Dacian commanded. "Honor the gods. Save yourself." This was the real test, the one the dragon in the marsh could never offer. The marsh beast wanted flesh. This beast wanted worship. Let's pause here again for a moment. Here, the legend shows its second face. The dragon in the marsh is terrifying, but it's honest. It does what beasts do. The tyrant is worse, because he wants what only God should have, the bending of the heart. And that's why this martyrdom act belongs with the dragon act. It isn't a sequel passed on. It's the fulfillment. Many people can summon courage for a moment of danger. But the deeper question is whether you can remain faithful when the danger comes dressed as authority. When the threat is not claws, but pressure. Not fire, but comfort and release. Not death alone, but the slow offer to survive, simply by surrendering your worship. St. George refuses that bargain. He teaches us the old truth every kingdom forgets at its peril. You can defeat the enemy outside the walls and still lose the kingdom from within, if fear and idolatry take the throne. Let's return to the story again. George stood among the idols and felt the weight of the lie. He saw how men had built gods that would never judge them, gods that would never call them to righteousness, gods that could be bribed with smoke. He lifted his voice, not in insult, but in refusal. He called upon God. And the legends say that fire came, sudden, consuming, tearing through the temple, shattering idols, reducing the proud house of false worship to ruin. The court cried out. Some fled, some fell to their knees, and one person, standing behind Dacian's throne, did not scream. She watched. She was Dacian's wife, Alexandria. She had lived in luxury. She had worn silk. She had smiled when her husband smiled, because that is what wives of tyrants learn to do if they want to stay alive. And as she watched the idols fall, she saw something she had never seen before. A man free. Not free because no one could touch him. Dacian had touched him plenty. Free because worship had unchained him. Alexandria stepped forward to her husband. "My lord," she said, voice trembling but clear, "your gods are nothing." The court froze. Dacian turned slowly. "Say that again," he whispered. She did. And in doing so, she crossed a line that no one crosses in a tyrant's house without cost. Dacian's face twisted. He threatened, he pleaded, he promised. But she had seen the idols burn, and she could not pretend she hadn't. I belong to Christ," she said. Dacian's hands clenched. He ordered her death. The story does not dwell on her last moments as spectacle. It simply insists on the meaning. She died with her allegiance intact, and her blood became her witness. Then Dacian turned back to George with a fury that had lost all decorum. "You have poisoned my house," he snarled. George's eyes stayed calm. "No," he said quietly. "Truth has entered it." Dacian could not tolerate that. He pronounced sentence. George would be paraded through the city and beheaded. They dragged him out beneath the sky. Crowds gathered. Some jeered, some watched in awe. Some watched with the slow, fearful awakening of conscience. George walked as a man walks when he has already placed his life in God's hands. At the place of execution, he asked for a moment. The soldiers laughed, but they granted it. Even beasts sometimes grant a pause before they bite. George knelt. He prayed for those who would remember him, and for those who would call upon God in their own dread, for those who would need courage when their own Dacians demanded worship. He asked God to meet them with mercy, and the legend says a voice answered from heaven. His prayer was granted. George rose. He looked at the sky once, blue, indifferent, beautiful, and he smiled faintly, not because death is sweet, but because death is not ultimate. Faith demands the whole heart. Then the blade fell, and the saint's triumph, his true triumph, was complete. Not because he avoided death, but because death did not make him bow. Dacian returned to his house that day with blood on his hands and fear in his chest, because deep down tyrants know a truth they cannot admit. When a man dies unafraid, the tyrant loses something no weapon can recover. The story says that judgment came swiftly. As Dacian moved through his hall, lightning struck, sudden as heaven's refusal, consuming him. The tyrant who demanded worship was taken by a power he could not threaten. And so ended the dragon of the court. 2 kingdoms had been defended. A city had been delivered from terror outside its walls, and an empire had been challenged by a faith that refused to bow inside its walls. And if you listen closely, you can hear what the legend is doing. The dragon in the marsh is a true monster, yes, but the deeper monster is what fear makes of a people. A city that will sacrifice children to keep its routines. A council that will call evil necessary. A king who will hide cowardice behind prudence. And at the same time, the tyrant is a true villain, yes, but the deeper villain here is the pull of idolatry. The demand that the soul worship power, that it treat comfort as God, that it sacrifice truth to survive. George stands against both, not as a flawless man, but as a faithful one. And the princess, who began as a victim, returns as a witness, the one who learned that courage is not only the strike, but the step. She did not swing the spear, but she did hold the girdle. She led the dragon. She prayed while the world shook. And that matters because myths teach through images what sermons sometimes struggle to say. Faith does not always look like conquest. Sometimes it looks like a trembling hand doing the next obedient thing. Sometimes it looks like a queen in a tyrant's house choosing truth over safety. Sometimes it looks like a saint kneeling at the edge of a blade and praying for people he will never meet. Fear always demands more, but faith, true faith, demands the whole heart, and then, strangely, gives it back, free. And so the story ends, and it leaves us with a question. What is the saint's triumph? It's not that George has it tougher than everyone else, and it's not that he is a fantasy hero who cannot be harmed. The triumph is that he refuses the 2 oldest bargain mankind keeps making. The bargain with fear, where to feed terror so that it won't touch us, and the bargain with power, where to offer worship so that we can keep our lives intact. The legend dares to say that a kingdom is defended not only by walls, but by conscience, not only by swords, but by worship, rightly ordered. And that is why St. George belongs in Echoes of Albion. and why he still echoes in the American imagination. Because we too are a people shaped by frontier threats and by courtly temptations. We know what it is to fear the wilderness, and we also know what it is to be tempted by safety that costs too much. Every generation must decide what it will sacrifice for peace, and what it will refuse to sacrifice, even if the refusal is costly. In the old hall where this story was once painted and recited, the point wasn't to congratulate listeners for being brave. It was to form them, so that when fear demanded more, they would recognize the demand and refuse. Thank you so much for listening to New American Mythos. If you want to help this show grow, share this episode with a friend. Leave a review where you listen to your podcasts, and join the mailing list. The link is below in the show notes. And if you'd like to support the work directly, you can find our Patreon link there too. Next time, we move from Dragonfire to Kingship and Covenant. Episode 209, Arthur, the once and future king. Until then, keep the fire burning.